Okay, Santiago, I can't see you on camera.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Santiago Lopez. I am a student in the first cohort of the PhD program Innovation in Global Development at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. This program wants to address the complex global challenges of the 21st century by creating new values about the meaning of development and its impact on societies. As part of the Leadership Foundation provided by the program, the Development Reimagined series are led by students. So I want to introduce to you to the rest of the team. We have Megan Joyce, Clinton Reisling, and Cesar Flores, who will be moderating the talk. The Development Reimagined series is a platform for exploring the intellectual foundations of innovative development thinking and strategies. This semester, the series is exploring innovative views in decolonizing development. I'm glad to announce our second talk of the series. This time, our speaker will talk about post-colonial Guyana, a fascinating energy paradox, sun, wind, oil and gas in a green state. Our two speakers are Dr. Gary Dirks and Dr. Paloma Mohamed Martin. Dr. Dirks is the director of the Julian Riley Global Institute of Sustainability. He's also the Julian Riley Chair of Sustainability Practices and a professor of practice in the School of Sustainability, and a distinguished sustainable scientist. Before joining ASU, Dr. Dirks was the president of British Petroleum, BP Asia Pacific, and the president of BP China. Our second speaker is Dr. Paloma Mohamed Martin, who will speak to us from Guyana. She is Deputy Vice Chancellor of Philanthropy, Alumni, and Civic Engagement at the University of Guyana. She is a behavioral scientist who was educated at University of Guyana, Harvard University, and the University of West Indies. ASU has a strong partnership with University of Guyana and Conservation International through a project called Guyana Resilience and One, or GROW. Welcome our speakers. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon.
So this is Gary speaking. Let me just say a few words of introduction. As you heard, there is a partnership in the development between Conservation International, University of Guyana, and Arizona State University. This partnership arose out of a grant that came from the Exxon Mobil Foundation to Conservation International, which has two parts to it as objectives. One is the preservation of natural capital, and the other is capacity building to support green development in Guyana. Professor Mohamed Martin and I and representatives from Conservation International are working towards exactly what that program will look like. That work is underway, and our aim is to complete a project plan to present to Exxon Mobil by April. The situation in Guyana has changed dramatically because of the discovery of oil offshore. And both Professor Martin and I will be saying more about that. But first, I would invite Professor Martin to provide some of the background on Guyana, and particularly focusing on some of the colonial issues as they arose in the past and how they present themselves now. So Professor Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me? We lost connection via the normal route of internet as you were sitting there, and I'm now using my phone. And so all of the lovely checking work that Megan and company would have done has just been dashed through the window. So yes, you can hear me. Lovely. So good afternoon, everybody. I am going to speak for a few minutes about what might be the nexus between colonialism and this idea of post-colonialism and development, and how Guyana seems to be trying to construct its future in the context of all of this. So I don't know how many people have heard of Guyana before. Before 2016, most people in the world would not have heard of Guyana because you know, there was nothing really remarkable happening there except for Jonestown in the 1980s, which was not very nice. And that didn't include Guyanese, too many of them. But in 2016, oil was announced. And since then, there have been some giant finds offshore Guyana, about 150 miles offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. The idea, when I saw the topic of this talk, you know, I was intrigued by it because when I think about the moment we're in now with regard to ExxonMobil and all the other 11 players in the basin, I thought of El Dorado. And if you know anything about El Dorado, Guyana was accidentally, it seems, discovered in the 1400s by a troop of European sailors, most notable among those gentlemen called Chris Columbus and then Walter Raleigh. And they came in search of this gilded city, this fabled place called El Dorado, in which everything was supposed to be, you know, full of gold. So Guyana's development, or so to speak, in the context of that, this moment reminds me very much of this El Dorado, except that the El Dorado that's being sought now is not on land, but it's actually in the sea, in the ocean. For me, the idea of post-colonialism is quite moot because I would like to suggest that there has been no post-colonialism. It's not a real concept. It's some nice ideas, but really and truly, I don't believe that in our region there has been much evidence to support the idea that there has been a complete and total possibility for self-determination by the countries that have been, so to speak, let loose in certain terms from their colonial masters. Guyana's history is very interesting in that it is contextualized at this moment by the colonialism that we experienced. So let me tell you what I think, how I see this. Colonialism was predicated upon the movement of people and capital competition. Guyana changed hands several times. We've actually been, you know, purportedly owned by several colonial powers. So it was the British, the Dutch first, then the Spanish, Portuguese, French for a short period, shortest period, and then finally for a long period, British. And then after the British disappeared from the country in a overt way, we became satellites of the American system. So colonialism for us has never quite disappeared, and this is why I am contesting the idea that it actually has disappeared. For Guyana, it resulted in the restructuring of everything that we knew. First of all, our brand of colonialism was very different from that practiced in India or Africa, because there was an interesting variant or variable that those other countries did not really see. But this has been fundamentally important because it transported thousands of people who were not native to this place over a period of 300-400 years and deposited them in this space. And so these people came from Africa, they came from India, they came from countries in Asia, China, Madeira, and of course you had the colonizing Europeans from all these other countries that I've spoken about. And this was different for us because here we have now a single space, and this is not only so for Guyana, the entire Caribbean, where you have transported now all of these peoples who have no connection really to the native environment in which they're going to find themselves. And this is important, I think, because have always been seen as an outward-looking people, people who are not connected to each other very well and not connected to the environment in which we find ourselves very much. And of course, this is because we're uprooted peoples. And of course, if you're uprooted and you're taken to Hawaii to have a good time, you might enjoy and love Hawaii somewhat. But if you're uprooted and taken as a slave on a plantation or indentured labor, the conditions that you find yourself in that environment itself, they're noxious, and so it is difficult. I think it would be difficult for you to have that same kind of positive connection to the environment as you would if you were in another place. But this afternoon, I want to focus upon really and truly how the enterprise of colonialism really impacted upon energy and where we are now. And so I want to skip and go to that because we don't have a huge amount of time. And the real energy expert, Professor Dirks, is in the room. And so I just want to give some context. So environment. The environment was really critical and very important to the development of colonies because of several reasons. One, colonizers needed to find physical environments, and I would argue other types of environments, certainly psychic ones, which could be conquered and sublimated, and which could support their transported labor. They had to find environments that were easy to get to and that were and which their technology could penetrate. And so at the time, the sailboat was the big thing. And Guyana has a number of rivers, about over 100 plus rivers. And of course, this saw the settlement of and the setting up of enterprise along those riverine areas. We have a big, long coast, which borders the Atlantic Ocean. And so there is where a lot of our people, in fact, over 80% of all our enterprise, our population is located there. So the real constructor or the real driving force behind how our energy system developed was this, that we needed access to ports to ship people and things in and out. We needed to protect from other marauding European and other forces. We needed to have an environment that was going to be supportive of the enterprise and that was not going to be hostile. So that was inland. You had a lot of, the environment inland was much more hostile. And of course you had the native peoples who were pushed from the coast straight inland, but they remained there. And you also needed to have a way to marshal and control in huge numbers of non-native and really unhappy labor along in a small space. So our energy grid developed in that context. So now in recent times, we have these problems. First of all, you have a grid that was set up for really not the purposes that we're trying to use them for now. There are old plantation type systems, and they are set up along the coast. We have since then had the dispersion of the population inward and across the country. And so, of course, Professor Dirks will tell you more about how you lose transmission quality, you lose power the further you go. But Guyana has a really tiny population. It's less than 700,000 people. And so the cost of moving the energy grid inward to these small populations and to supply them is much greater, because you don't have the numbers there to support a big kind of movement inward. So you have large areas in the country, very large areas in the country, which are not serviced by the grid. Large numbers of people who do not have power on a stable basis. We have even those who are supplied by the old grid, very unstable power. We have some blackouts at least once or twice a day here at the university, and we have our generator kick in. And in other places which are considered non-essential, you may have more. This is, of course, a huge constraint on the Guyana's ability to do several things. Certainly the productivity and of simple daily endeavors is interrupted consistently. But then when you get to working on huge projects such as manufacturing and so on, this is a problem. So for us, the government's latest, well, not latest, but they have been for a few years, over the last 20 years or so, predicating development on this idea of a green state. And it's not been called the same thing. A previous government called it LCD, a low carbon development strategy. But this government is calling it the Green State Development Plan. But at the core of this is the idea that Guyana wants to do a couple of things. One, it wants to ensure that it is able to protect its almost pristine environmental status in the world. We just got named first in the world for ecotourism just about a week or so ago. We have some of the most unpolluted waterways in the world. We certainly have the biggest lungs of the world in terms of Amazon forests and species that have just been discovered and are protected. We have a huge area of protected areas for human life. And we want to be able to use this as the core and impetus for a type of development which says that which predicates and indicates that we should use this for clean energy. A friend of mine has told me that there's no such thing as green energy, but I hear it all the time in the technical language. So I'm not going to say that, but that's what we say in our technical writing. But really what it means is that we're looking at renewables and trying to not use the over-reliance on fossil fuels, which has been historic. So we spend upwards of 25% of our GDP on importing fossil fuels. So that's a huge number. So it's really a problem, and we don't do much with that. So we lose about 28% of that, according to some experts that we've spoken to. The other part of it, of course, it has to do with equitable development, which across the country, this has not happened. And this is, I think, really embedded in this idea or this colonial context. Or that these people came and they were distinct people, and there's always been this contestation among the people themselves and this disconnect from each other that is making life in Guyana very difficult to conduct at the local level. And of course, because we are inextricably connected to and linked by these historical circumstances to this colonial superstructure, and a structure that I would consider to be a global system of really appropriation of other people's resources, then we have some issues with how we conduct ourselves. So enter oil now into the picture. It's outside, most of it, in the Atlantic, and I sometimes refer to this in my thinking and speaking about it as Guylantis, which is Guyana's Atlantis, right? Because somewhere in the minds of those people who are constructing Guyana's future, on paper at least, they seem to be thinking that it is possible to separate what's happening in the sea with this huge find and development by companies like Exxon and others, because Exxon is not the only one there, but Exxon is the biggest for the moment. Well, it's probably always going to be the biggest, but it's the biggest, but it's one of 11 who are exploring. And so we seem to think that we can take the money from this enterprise and without consequence pour it into these other things that we want to do. And that is a tension and a problematic that we really should, as a nation and as a nation, are trying to kind of understand how that could happen. And this may be something for your class to figure out eventually and help us to do. Because there's an ecology, and the two things are not separate. The marine environment and the life on land are not completely exclusive to each other, and so we have to consider how this is going to really work. The second thing is, and again coming back to my original premise, that there is really no decolonization, and that it just changed form, became more sophisticated, and that Guyana really does not or may not have its own agency in deciding, or total agency in deciding, what it wants to do with its future, and the presence of a huge multinational, supranational company and several others in the country, and the interests that come with them. How are we going to construct this idea, or this future, that we are going to simply not have this oil come on land? We're going to do nothing. We're just going to take the money from it, and we're going to just, develop all these other things. These interests may have other ideas, and they probably do. The question of what do we do with the gas that comes off and how much gas we're getting. I was just off a conference call a few hours ago with the director of energy, who is saying that they're now advancing apace the idea of what to do with the gas and what Guyana wants to do, and that there's a good bit of it there, and that this may be actually a way, a kind of a intermediary kind of approach that they want to take in the short term to developing a mixed energy bucket for Guyana. So we have a number of issues around this question of oil and gas and the environment, and to settle. It's not going to be settled this afternoon, and I just wanted to close by saying that I just hope that Guyana can find a middle ground with all of these interests, with all of its resources and all of the present circumstances, not only on the ground in Guyana, but prevailing in the world. Certainly the whole movement against climate change should be in the mix. And I should say that Guyana is 7 feet below sea level. So Exxon and company are actually 7 feet above us in the sea, doing what they do, although they're going 3,000 feet down and more. So we have some concerns, some environmental concerns as well for greenhouse gases and emissions, and what that does not only to Guyana but to the Caribbean, to the sea levels, and to everything else. And I would really hope that conversations like these and thinking like this helps us to begin to define a model for Guyana that can actually speak to and address the tension between wanting to do what's environmentally correct and holding on to the idea of green and sustainable as the core that holds strong, but everything else supports it and pushes it forward. Otherwise, I think that we will have failed in our endeavors, and I wouldn't like to see that happen. I want to thank Gary, Professor Dirks, and the team at ASU for the opportunity to get out of my administrative desk and do some thinking around these areas. Dr. Mark Tunbridge, who's our post-colonial specialist here at UG, and Dr. Devin Gardner, an energy specialist from CARICOM, as well as Lance Hines, the chair of the Guyana Energy Authority, for data that I've used, not in the talk, but basically in preparing for this, and for the ideas and feedback on the presentation. Thank you all for listening, and Gary, I hope that you can take it from here.
Thank you very much, Paloma. What I would like to do now is say a little bit more about the energy system, and I think it's appropriate to, in the context of development, to talk about energy because it's so important in creating a foundation for development of all of its types. Now, I think were we standing 15, 20 years into the future, we would be looking at this time period right now, the time period between 2016, when first oil was discovered, and 2020, when the first oil should be produced, and say that was a watershed moment in the history of energy in Guyana, and in many ways in the development of Guyana. Watershed in the sense that what was happening before is likely to be very different than what we're facing going forward in the energy system. Let me say just a little bit more about the development because it is in fact an extraordinary find and an extraordinary development. The partners and Dr. Martin was clear about the fact that there are actually 11 partners out working on a number of different blocks, but among them, they have found about 5 billion barrels of oil, and they're still discovering more. And in fact, to what an oil man would, like myself, would consider an extraordinary situation, just about all the wells that are being drilled are finding oil. It is going to turn out to be one of the more extraordinary fields in the Western Hemisphere. What that means, 5 billion barrels of oil, is that at a price of $50 a barrel, which is probably a little bit low, we're talking about $250 billion of revenue. It is a good quality oil. It is a medium grade, will easily be marketed into the United States and into Europe, and especially into Europe, because that grade is particularly good for producing diesel fuel. The estimated cost of development would suggest that there will be a comfortable profit margin to be made even at $50 a barrel. So this is a development that is going to generate a lot of value for somebody. I did send around a link that some of you may have had a chance to look at. It is a technically challenging, but not an extraordinarily difficult field. As Paloma suggested, it's in about 5,000 feet of water, and it's another 12,000 feet down into the formation. Exxon will be doing all of this from a floating platform. The wellheads will actually sit on the ocean floor and be managed with submersibles and robots of various different descriptions. Oil and gas will be brought up to a surface ship where liquids are separated. Water, gas are separated from the oil. The oil will be offloaded and taken directly to market. at least initially, the gas and other water and other materials will be re-injected into the field. Now, the reason for going through all that detail is, at least so far, none of these hydrocarbons are coming onshore. And very little activity with respect to development of this field is going to go onshore across the board. There will be some, there's been some upgrading of the port in Georgetown for some staging to go on there, but a lot of it is going to take place offshore. There will not be a lot of oil industry jobs created by this development. There will be a few, but not a lot. And it's going to be feel like a very remote development. ExxonMobil is the kind of company that does not typically see that it is their problem on what happens onshore in a case like this or away from their development. They will look at the contract. They will fulfill the contract, at least in the way they interpret it. And once they've fulfilled the contract, they tend to believe that's the end of their responsibility. What that means is that they're anticipating writing checks to the government of Guyana, and what happens after that is not their problem. Now, that's not entirely the case. There is a lot of geopolitical complexity already developing around Guyana. Venezuela claims a lot of the territory where this oil and gas is being found. Most people, including the United Nations and CARICOM, disagree with that claim, that the border dispute had been settled long ago, but nonetheless, they have sent warships across the border and have, at least at the margin, harassed exploration ships. Once full development is reached, you could expect Guyana to be producing somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 barrels a day of oil, which will make them one of the largest oil producers in the world. They would be right up with the top tier. A big question going forward is what happens with the natural gas. Initially, the company will re-inject that gas to maintain pressure. But as Paloma has already indicated, there is interest on the side of the company, the companies, and the government of Guyana in bringing that gas onshore. It remains to be seen whether that will actually happen or not. It's my understanding that Exxon would not do more than lay the pipeline to the shore and sell the gas. And what happens onshore would largely be up to the country of Guyana, which means they would have to pay for and develop those facilities. If it is brought onshore, the intention is for it to be primarily used for generating electricity. As Dr. Martin indicated earlier, there are issues with the grid, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. And so one possible use of the gas is to support natural gas generating stations to supply electric power to the grid. There's also discussion of an industrial park where natural gas could be used as a raw material. But I will come back to all of that in a moment. So that's kind of where we are at the moment with respect to the development. I would like to go back and say just a little bit about the energy system in slightly more detail than what Dr. Martin has discussed earlier. As she indicated, the energy system as it currently is structured is overwhelmingly based on fossil fuels. The number one import into the country, as she indicated, is refined oil products. Mostly it's diesel and gasoline. for power generation and for transportation. In fact, their energy mix or the energy consumption pattern is a relatively standard one that you would find in many countries, where about a third of energy is going into generation of electricity, about a third is going into transportation, and then miscellaneous goes into the other things. They're importing about 4.9 million barrels of hydrocarbon a year, which in international terms is very low. And this brings me to one of the first major development points I'd like to make, and that is much of Guyana is underserved from an energy standpoint, and per capita consumption of energy is low by international standards. And that is potentially problematic from a development standpoint. First, because there are large underserved populations, and Paloma has mentioned that earlier, where the grid simply doesn't get there, and transportation fuel, when it does get to these locations, is very expensive, and often it's coming out of the informal economy. One of the challenges that the government of Guyana has is frankly bootlegged imports coming into the country and stolen fuel as well. The electricity system evolved mainly for two reasons. One is to support Georgetown. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. One is to support Georgetown and some of the population centers, but the other important development was for the plantations and for the mines. And in fact, you'll find a number of the developments in the more remote regions have less to do with supporting the population than it does to do with supporting mining. What that means is that not a lot of critical attention was paid in the early days to how these various different developments would fit together. And in fact, two entirely separate grids evolved. One that operates at 110 volts and 60 hertz, which is very much comparable to the US system. The other one is 220 volts and operates at 50 hertz, which is very much like the British system. Now, the problem with that is that you cannot share power between those two grids. They have to operate at the same frequency. And since they don't, there can't be any sharing that goes on between the two. There is a plan to convert the 220 and 50 hertz system to 260 hertz so they can unify the grid. It's unclear to me, Paloma may know what the answer to this is, unclear to me when exactly that's supposed to happen, but there is a plan to do that. Now, let me say a little bit about renewable energy in the energy system going forward. Prior to the discovery of the oil and gas offshore, the intention in Guyana was very much to develop the energy system along green or renewable lines, meaning to emphasize hydropower resources, emphasize biomass resources, and emphasize solar resources. Some effort has gone in that direction. There's been investment in biomass, for example. A lot of that power that's generated from biomass is on the plantations and is used on the plantations, but there is some that is exported to the grid, and there's capacity to do more. Guyana has enormous hydropower potential, vastly more than the country could imagine using any time into the future that's reasonably worth thinking about. But a lot of the prime areas for development are also some of the most beautiful parts of Guyana on incredible river systems. And a lot of what's being discussed is meant more for export than it is for consumption by Guyanese. So they've got some really quite difficult choices to make about just how much hydropower to develop and in what form. Do they do big, massive dam developments that are gigawatt in scale? Or do they do more modest developments that would be run of rivers and don't require big dams and dam systems in order to develop it? These are open and outstanding questions. There have been plans of various descriptions put forward, but Paloma can correct me if I've got this wrong, but up to this point, developments have been sporadic. And again, going back to the idea of mining, a number of the early developments of hydropower were in fact for supporting mines. The solar power potential is large, but not a lot has been deployed. And a lot of what has been deployed, or at least some of what's been deployed, goes again is in the informal economy. People are using it very locally, and it's not grid connected. The last estimate that I saw, about 1 megawatt of solar has been installed in Guyana. Quite a lot of that has been in the last few years, particularly on government buildings, school buildings, public places of that type. But the potential for it is very large. It would be easy for Guyana to have considerably more solar energy than what they do. They also have some wind power potential, but not a lot of that's been developed. So the picture that I would like to paint for you is a country that has been up to this point very much committed to more green development of its energy sector, but now faces the choice of what to do with this natural gas. Because make no mistake about it, if they use the natural gas, then that will be the backbone for the power sector, more or less indefinitely into the future. Because Guyana, for the immediate future, could get by reasonably well with about 200 megawatts of additional power generation. And the numbers that I've seen would suggest there's more than enough gas to support generation in that range for several decades. So this is a very important choice that they will now need to make. There is the potential to be much greener and not use this natural gas, and the gas could stay offshore and be injected, but they'll have to decide. The key thing going forward, if Guyana does not bring the gas onshore, will be developing the human capacity, the financial capacity, and the business capacity to radically and rapidly accelerate development of green energy. And that, in my opinion, and I haven't been there enough to say this with certainty, but in my opinion, what has slowed Guyana down really is capacity. There just aren't enough people and there aren't enough businesses that understand renewable energy that are willing to get the finance, take the risks associated with making these kinds of investments and push them forward. So should Guyana decide to be much greener than the natural gas would permit, there is a capacity building opportunity that could very well be part of what we talk about with Guyana and with Conservation International going forward. So I'll stop there, and I think we are both prepared to take some questions.
Okay, so getting ready for the questions. A few things that we need to consider is we have a mic that is right there. So we have two options. Whoever wants to ask the question can come and sit down here, or tell me what that question is, and I'll be happy to repeat it into the mic. And the other consideration is that so we can have enough time for most of you to ask your questions, we would ask you to make your question as short as possible. Sorry? Of course, we'll ask you to introduce yourself before your question. So when you're ready, please raise your hand, and we have the seat and the mic.
Is that better?
Yes.
Can we start with?
My name is Stephanie Franco, and I work for the Pathfinder Center and the Biodesign Institute. Your talk was great, thank you. The question that I have was, how can education for both classroom teachers and their students prepare the next generation to tackle some of these concerns that your talk discussed?
Paloma, why don't you take that one?
Okay, I don't know if, okay, so for us, one of the things that Gary was absolutely correct about a couple of things. One is that we don't have the capacity in country, enough people who know about the technical aspects of how to do what we want to do. So we have to do a couple of things. One, we have to import them quickly. If we have money, we'll buy them. In the past, we used to negotiate for them, but now we may have money to buy some of them. Secondly, we have to start prioritizing whatever it is we decide to do across the education system, from nursery to all the way up to university. And one of sources that I was reading in preparation, that only 3 countries in the Caribbean, and Guyana is not one of them, has prioritized anything to do with specific resources, has started to do this. And so we need to start working with hang on.
Perhaps while we're waiting for Paloma to...
Yes, she was able to help us. Oh, what did I do? I think I just did something.
You're okay.
Yeah,
You broke up a bit,
yeah.
Paloma.
I'm back.
You're back.
So one of the things that yeah, that's because somebody was calling on my phone. I'm sorry. So yes, and so I was trying to deal with that. Yeah, so we need to have, I think, an education plan that supports whatever decision is made at the policy level for educating people, putting the resources towards them, finding the correct partners, bringing people into the country who know what to do, sending people out who have to learn from those who know what to do. So it's, you know, normal strategic decisions, but the fundamental issue is that we have to decide what it is we want to do. We can't do everything. And right now, the energy policy that I've seen up to 2020 is speaking about doing all kinds of things. And I think we have to make a decision as to, you know, what it is that we want to prioritize. Most of what is happening in alternative energy and sustainable energy is really at the very, you know, preliminary nascent level in terms of research being done in very small pilots. So we have to scale those up as well. So there's a lot to be done by education. Almost everything, I think, has to be done by education if the policy structure and funding will be set up otherwise.
And if I might say just one thing.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Paloma.
Oh, I'm frozen. Oops.
If I may add just one thing.
Oh, well, the video.
I think it's important to, I think,
all right.
You're back. So I think it's important to recognize the scale of the challenge for Guyana. This is a country of about 750,000 people that has, frankly, never experienced an influx of capital and wealth even remotely like this in its modern history. And any country of that size would be enormously challenged in order to develop the human capacity in particular to be able to handle what lies ahead. So there is quite a large challenge, as Paloma was suggesting, to how do you find those people in the short term? But more importantly, how do you develop them in the medium term, so that you have the skills that you need in order to manage something of this complexity?
Thank you.
Any other questions? Would you like to know? Sure.
I think they've muted me so I could rub my nose.
Hi there. My name's Phil. I'm a master's student at the School of Sustainability. My main question is kind of just piggybacking on what's already been spoken on. You mentioned capacity building, and when I read a lot about Guyana, I hear about brain drain and people finishing their education and leaving. Do you think the narrative with, oil being, the revenue hopefully providing livelihoods, do you think that's going to kind of rewrite the narrative of people leaving, or do you think there's more that needs to be put in place to, make sure that students aren't leaving after they get their education, or that there is opportunities for, people to build that capacity in a sense?
I think that's an excellent question. Are they hearing me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, all right. I think that's an excellent question, and I think that this is, there's this perception that there are twice as many Guyanese outside of Guyana as there are in Guyana, and there might in fact be some of that capacity already in the world that we can hopefully repatriate from the diaspora. So that's one thing. And secondly, yes, absolutely. I think that if there are opportunities here and there is a good standard of living and it's peaceful, certainly the narrative of Guyana of looking outward always is going to change. And people are going to start coming here, not only Guyanese, but we will see other people coming here as well. In fact, over the last 18 months, we've seen almost 6,000 people come into the country. Of course, about 3,000 of those are Venezuelans and Brazilians fleeing the conflict in those countries, but others are people from the Caribbean, from Suriname, from Trinidad, from other parts of the world, coming here to seek opportunities and to work in the oil and allied industries. So definitely, I think that narrative is going to change. Once we're able to be stable, and this is the thing about the complexity, because we have other challenges which are always looming large over the country.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Andrew Inkpen. I'm a faculty member at Thunderbird. In addition to human capacity, you're going to have to build regulatory and governance structures so that hopefully you end up more like Norway and I guess less like Equatorial Guinea or Angola. Where are you in terms of those structures and building those structures and building that capacity?
Right, that's also a really excellent question. Guyana has been doing a number of things, and one of the, I think, really interesting things that has happened that is pushing this is that we have a kind of very vibrant, aggressive press that has been using the technology to basically look at what has happened in other countries and to push the oil companies and the government to try to make as robust a regulatory framework as possible. So for instance, we have, of course, the well-known call for the review of these contracts, which I'm not sure is going to happen now, but certainly the next round of contracts are not going to be as generous as these ones are. We have a Sovereign Wealth Fund Act that has just been passed. We have the local content policy. We have a petroleum commission. And several other attendant processes that are going on now through the Department of Energy at a rapid rate. But all of these are happening in parallel and happening simultaneously, all of them involving training Guyanese, and all of them involving bringing expertise into the country that we need. I am not close enough to that part of it to be able to speak more comprehensively on it, but I do know that a number of these things are happening, and a number of them, having just had a meeting just with the Department of Energy just before I came here, a number of them are expected to be settled by November this year. So they are certainly thinking about the Norway model. We have been working with a number of agencies, like certainly with Norway is doing a lot of training, Petrad, or people, we've been working with the New Producers Association. I mean, a number of these organizations have shown up and are helping, I think, to construct the narrative of transparency and accountability and sustainability, which I believe there has been a kind of a robust attempt at responding to.
I am as well.
If necessary.
So maybe Dr. Dirks and Dr. Paloma, maybe you have some closing comments for the audience.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of odd to be speaking to people and not be able to see them. It's not a usual thing, but I did appreciate the little part of the room there, and maybe it was a good thing that I didn't see the room before I started talking. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I believe that ASU has certainly in some of the schools I've been able to visit, and with some of the people that we have been able to work with thus far, I believe ASU has the approach that we would like to take, which is this problem-solving approach and the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach to dealing with problems like the ones that Guyana has. It's a good problem to have in a certain sense because we have all of these wonderful possibilities, but there are also constraints. But I think the possibilities outweigh the constraints. I believe that what is important now for the country is some very empirically based, objective based decision-making about what is really best and what it is that is to be done, and the capacity both in terms of will, in terms of vision, and in terms of other kinds of resources to basically build those things out as quick as possible. It is my own personal wish and view that Guyana can in fact be a model for the world, just because of the conditions that we have on the ground, a small place, fairly contained, fairly stable, and for a development of a new model and a way of doing business in terms of energy and sustainability that may in fact endure beyond my life and certainly others, the lives of others. And if there are young students in the room who are thinking about this problem, maybe Guyana might be a good place for you to come and do some work and help us to solve some of these problems. I thank you all so much for the opportunity.
Let me just add a couple of things to what Paloma said, because that was a brilliant summary and hard to add to. But I think it probably goes without saying, given what we both said, that the challenges that lie ahead for Guyana are in fact truly extraordinary. History did not leave the country in a good place from a social cohesion standpoint. and the demands of the development that's going on offshore can't be underestimated. Having said that, I'm very optimistic about the future. And I'm optimistic for two reasons, one of which Paloma has already mentioned, which is that there really is a desire, at least on the part of those government of people that I've met and civil society, university people, to base decisions as much as possible on objective evidence and make good decisions based on facts. But the other, I think, reason is equal, if not more important, and that is there's quite an extraordinary core of people, Dr. Mohamed Martin being an example of that, who are truly deeply committed to the future of Guyana. And they're working literally tirelessly at all levels to try to make sure that these new revenues are going to create a model country to be admired. And that makes me terribly optimistic and very energized about the partnership that we have with them.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as we finish this conversation, we want to thank our audience. Thank you so much for being here with us, for your amazingly intelligent questions. And Dr. Dirks, Dr. Mohamed Martin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing all this information with us and for your insight.
Thank you.